to the first episode of Talk That Talk. My name is D.A.P.H.N.E Rudolph. I am the host and creator of Talk That Talk, an online conversation series addressing systemic issues in the South African classical music industry. So, the reason why I started this channel is a reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement, where I have seen systemic issues within the classical music industry and have experienced discrimination and have felt that I can use my voice and my platform to address these issues and encourage transformation. I would like to introduce my first guest, South African composer Arthur Feeder, and all-round South African artist Kirsten Adams. Arthur Feeder and Kirsten Adams are my two guests for the first episode of Talk That Talk. So thank you so much to you guys for gracing me with your beautiful presence and your conversation, my platform. And I really hope that through these conversations we can encourage change and really just get going with transformation, because this entire project has been born out of just seeing that there is a need for us to speak about certain things that have not been spoken about within the classical industry. And I feel that it is something that's kind of been the elephant in the room, but we don't speak about it. And I think for us to actually instill change and transformation, we have to be open about it. We have to be candid about what's been happening in this industry. We are all here because we started out as classical musicians, or we've been trained in classical music. So we have a love for classical music, of course, but just because you have a love for something doesn't mean you shouldn't call it out, hold it accountable, etc. To speak about the first point, the African identity as perceived through the European lens.
Yeah, I actually have a few things to say about this. And not just through a European lens, but through a South African lens as well. So this is something that's been bothering me for a long time. Like, what is, especially within music, like, what is African identity? And it's such a complex thing, actually, because you either get told that you are not, you're constantly walking this tightrope, because you're either being told that you are appropriating or you aren't looking enough. And then so you always have this tension. It's like, what is my identity in South Africa? And that's from South Africans themselves. Like things like SAMRO, the SAMRO overseas competition that asks you to include Africanism in your music. What is Africanism? Do I write for djembe, or do I go and steal an African melody? Like what is it?
I can definitely sound off of that and say that there's this tokenism around often there's this tokenism around African identity within the South African music institution that I find very often. The South African music institution is very much governed by European manner of managing a music institution. And so the tokenism is what I've noticed, especially when it comes to call for scores, as you've mentioned about the SAMRO thing. When I say things like call for scores, I can see how it can go wrong with appropriation, because when you're, for instance, if you're asking someone that is not of African descent, whatever that is, which we still have to unravel, if you're asking someone that's not of African descent to apply themselves in an African way to their work, then it becomes a mess, because no one's really had the conversation in music institutions. It's not like a really deeply embedded conversation in music institutions. And with my history in a music institution, for 6 years, yeah, this theme of tokenism comes up again, because it's like we're still trying to find ways of creating this narrative around Africanism while we're in an African country. So that's the thing that's been bothering me a lot, is that we do not know how to use the resources that are right in front of us, and we don't talk about it.
No, I like what you're saying, like the tokenism, because that's obviously the problem. Is like, as a composer, you want to be authentic as well. So you never want to, you don't want to appropriate music. And being authentic is like really getting into the sound worlds and understanding the mechanics and understanding the cultural significance of things. And often, especially as a colored person, like colored identity is even worse than African identity, because it's like, where are we?
Yeah.
And yeah, this idea that you're constantly on this tightrope between being a token or stealing from someone else, and where you find your authenticity within that is really tricky.
It's quite interesting that you brought up Sunro, where we are asked, or composers are asked to write for, with this African idea or with this African identity in mind. But as Kirsten said, it's not something that we talk about. It's not something that's actually discussed. I mean, if you think of how we are taught to engage with European composers, there's an entire story behind it. There is this, let's say, for example, we take Shostakovich, and you immediately just think of how he, as a composer, what he did for his country, and this, this patriotism. And then you think, but are we actually teaching South African composers? Is there a course that says, but what is your role as a South African composer? How do you write? How do you identify yourself within this huge genre or this sort of subcategory? Because I think quite often we don't see ourselves as directly connected to Western classical music.
Yeah, so I sent you a article yesterday, actually. The title was about how Black people in America create a community within the Classical Music Society in America. And there was a lot of things that I resonated with there, because there was a line, I think there was a paragraph based on how in order to get Black people interested in classical music in America, they need to be able to relate to it somehow. And I think the foundations for someone that is more of European descent or has that classical lineage in their family, it's already there. So it's not like there's this, dissonance. And when I read that, I immediately thought to my Opa, because he loves Cavalleria Rusticana, and whenever he hears it, he starts whistling, or he loves to do this, like he loves to impersonate the trombone to it. The reason why he can resonate with it is because he saw it in a film back in his day. And it's like that narrative, he's now got a narrative to convince him to go and listen to that music. So I felt like that a lot of my life, growing up in a mostly classical musical trajectory, because all we listened to as a family that was, predominantly colored, was more, the jazz music and, the R&B and the pop and stuff. And yeah, it's about being able to bring a narrative to people that do not directly link to the classical narrative. And so how do you, that takes time, right? Because you can't just go and drop in a community. This is just my opinion, but you can't just go and drop into a community and say, this is classical music and you shall listen. it's it's, and I see that happening a lot, and it's almost like if you're coming to show us that kind of music but not bothering to listen to our music, then why should we bother reciprocating?
Yes.
So this is the problem. This is obviously linking to, community work when it comes to classical music institutions. And I hope that we can, merge those lines better. But we need to start obviously just talking about it, because I think a lot of this has to do with ignorance. Ignorance is bliss, because with the ignorance, you can preserve your ways.
I'd like to latch onto that because it's something that after the orchestra discussion that we recently had, um, that is exactly what I was starting to think. Is like, by just going into communities and teaching people how to play your music, you're actually just colonizing their talent.
Yeah.
You're just taking their abilities and you're not actually giving them a voice. You're teaching them to be your voice. And that I have a huge issue with. And it's not that difficult to imagine Kwela music in an orchestra. It's not that difficult to imagine Miskandi or anything actually. I mean, if it was that difficult, we wouldn't have Piazzolla, right? Like this idea
Exactly.
that we can't do it is narrow-minded.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's quite lazy actually, because throughout this movement that I've seen, the Black Lives Matter movement, how the classical industry has responded has been quite varied. And the way that,
mm,
let's say, they've responded negatively, or the lack of response, has basically just
mm,
been ignorance and just
mm,
laziness, because we are aware of the fact that we are in an industry that centers whiteness. So
mm,
you cannot just say that, oh, well, we're not aware of it, or these are resources that are perhaps too complicated for us to consult. Because surely, when it comes to being an African in an African country, you have to think about who are
mm.
the people that we say we represent, and is there
Yeah.
active engagement with the community, or are we
Mm,
just reaching out? I think that might have been included in the article that you sent me, Kirsty, where it was community engagement instead of community outreach, where
mm,
you're not just going to say, for example, you go to the Cape Flats, you go to Hanover Park, and you go to Hanover Park, and it's like, well, okay, here we're going to show you the Radetzky March for the 100th time. Absolutely no
mm.
one is going to be emotionally stirred. None of those colored kids, black kids, BIPOC kids are going to feel, yes, this is something that I strongly believe that I can
Yeah.
resonate with. Instead, you can take the District 6 suites, or just Guma rhythms, anything that you
Mm,
feel. But this community, what is their music about? What are they about as a community? Let me actually try and research those people,
yeah.
or the community, or the culture. It's really not that complicated, I believe.
Today, that's what music should be, right? It should be about sharing, not about me telling you what to say or what to do. Um,
Mm.
and I think this is why South Africa is both at a disadvantage and at a major advantage. Like South Africa has this like melting pot of culture, which
Period.
is amazing as a composer because I can hear Xhosa melodies next to Malay melodies, and I have access to all of that all the time. So I think that also makes our job more difficult to decide what is Africanism in music. Um,
And it also makes it difficult to decide now who has that right, because of
yeah,
the problem of appropriation.
yeah,
I mean, this is now going outside of music, but let's take an analogy of, white people wearing box braids. The definition of appropriation is, going about or using from a different culture without the consent of that respective culture. So you don't know, where to get that consent. And if you get that consent, how do you communicate that consent to your audience? So there's that problem that I can almost resonate with the white person that so badly wants to engage, like for instance, Johnny Clegg, who just engaged with the Zulu culture and embedded that in his music. I mean, you could also refer to that as appropriation, but it's music that I thoroughly enjoy, and that the whole of South Africa enjoys, and you can actually see that he has been engaging with the Zulu culture a lot, and like investing his time into getting to know the culture, whereas in a lot of other instances there's a case of just like surface level usage of those cultural materials. And then it just brings me back to the Samro posts about featuring an African element in your composition. So basically, like, I want to propose with this, like, to actually further converse about to what extent do you get consent in terms of appropriation, and at the same time, how can that person that does not fall part of the culture engage a bit more with that culture to a point where it is accepted to be able to use from that culture. And I say this in such a way that I'm almost resonating with people that lie more towards European lineage in South Africa, because I have struggled with my identity as a colored person. I've said this in a conversation before with Lynn, where I struggle with being able to commit racism and at the same time being able to receive it. So like, it's just this confusion about, are we even allowed to borrow? Do we need to go and look at a family tree or something? But I know that, there's a lot of talk that needs to happen around this.
For me, I think that the answer, and this is what Clegg got right, is to be authentic and respectful. To never, like you say, Clegg was completely ingrained into Zulu culture. He understood everything that was happening. And I only found this out last year, but he was an anthropologist himself. So he actually like really understood the Zulu culture. And I think that's what you need to do. But at the same time, as a composer, you can't escape the sounds that you hear. Like if you hear something, it creeps into your imagination. It's such a weird place to be.
So we spoke a little bit, we touched on the colored identity. So I just wanted just spend a few minutes on how you have been alienated from your community, if you have felt alienated from your community. Kirsty, you've spoken about the confusion that you feel within your colored identity, and that is something that we've discussed, and I've also resonated with, where I felt because classical music has not been something that is embedded within the colored culture, that because I grew up with it, I felt that my identity as a colored and the music industry that I'm in cannot be connected, that the two are two separate worlds. And only recently with the Black Lives Matter movement, where we've again seen resurgence of Black material, Indigenous material, POC material, Black composers, artists, where you see people who look like you and who have shared similar stories. I think that has been quite beautiful, something that has I think, been almost the paradigm shift in society. So
Mine is a bit weird there because so I grew up with classical music and in a colored context because it was part of our church. Like we sang Bach, that was just normal. And then I got to Stellenbosch and I was expected to know Guma. And as someone from the Northern Cape, that's not, we don't have the klopse there. So it's a bit of a reverse thing. But yeah, as a colored, I was expected to have an identity that was Cape Townian. When actually I grew up with, I didn't really listen to jazz when I was a kid. I listened to Bach and Mozart, and that was normal amongst my family. And obviously, we still listen to R&B. I don't think there's a color that doesn't. So that was my musical upbringing. I was also fortunate to be in a music class where we were oddly we were two black kids, two colored kids, and two white kids. So we shared everything. We shared. We would listen to black music and colored music, and well, I suppose let's say white popular music, so rock and stuff like that, equally. So I never actually felt alienated. I felt confused, definitely, but never out of place.
This is obviously what adds to, you know, our perception of where we stand with music today. Yeah, mine was definitely so throughout my childhood, throughout my schooling, I had been in a predominantly white space. And within these white spaces, obviously, white culture was imposed. And I felt, I definitely felt in those spaces that I couldn't bring out who I was. So it was almost like this part of me was silenced for a while. And obviously, when I speak about music, our primary focus was classical music, and of home time for listening to pop, listening to R&B, being a Spice Girl, you know, the sixth Spice Girl. There were five, right? Yeah. And when I come to school, then I would be, yeah, I would be practicing classically and going through traditional ways of, you know, learning the instrument classically. So I was registered for an Eisteddfod for singing, and we picked out our pieces and repertoire, and then I started singing. I think this was probably, you know, one of the first lessons. And when I started singing, I sang the way that I heard in all the songs I listened to at home. And when I did, then my teacher said, "No, you're not a pop singer. This is not pop music. You're not a pop singer. Sing properly." Yeah, that hurts.
wow.
So from there on, I got the feeling that I could not ever share my true love for pop music, my true love for R&B. And that is how I felt like I had to live my classical upbringing, purely separate. And I feel like the hostility in the air, you know, that's carried from apartheid kind of seeps into that, you know, this like separation mentality. Only recently have I started learning, as I've entered a more pop avenue, that I can, in fact, join the two styles together, which is exactly what I do in my current music. There is a lot of experimental stuff that I want to do on my own as I start learning how to produce my own music. And which will hopefully happen at NYU at some point. But yeah, I love bringing things together, and it's a comment that part of me right now is a comment on, you know, how much I've been what's the word, like how much I've been silenced and how much I've been suppressed almost indirectly as to, you know, just coming out with my the other side of me. So I'm basically making up for the past in a way.
It's a wonderful thing though, hey, because that complexity in music is at the core of colored identity. The mix of influences I'd say is at the core of colored identity and at the core of South African identity. Um, I think for me personally, I was the person that stood in my own way of incorporating non-Western elements into my music for a long time, um, because I thought it was wrong, because I thought it wasn't good enough, and that's really something that you have to break down, and it's difficult to teach. I'm speaking now as an educator here. It's difficult to teach that to students. Like, just write. Don't care now. Like, if I have to fight for you, I'll protect you. But for now, just write.
Yeah.
And that's actually something I can say about Hans. Hans did that. At one point, his composition course was judged, and they said we focus too much on non-experimental music. And so Hans wrote a piece with electric guitar and called it Or to Earth. And he had the biggest load of fun. And he was like, come back, my students.
I love that freedom.
Yeah,
I really enjoy that freedom under the tutelage of Hans Rosenskoen, because it really like forced you at the same time to like be a bit more experimental and go beyond your horizons, but also to formulate it in your own way. And it's almost like that freedom of speech, but just within the practice of composition, is what I really, really appreciated from Professor. So, yeah.
So we've spoken about how we can actually engage with communities. I know that there's also been a lot of discussion as to how orchestras have engaged with composers and whether there are programs available for young composers. So I just want to open the floor to you guys if you want to maybe speak about how we can holistically engage with BIPOC communities. And again, not just engaging in, I am showing you what it is to play the violin or the trombone or whatever, but to actively engage with the community, to come with a more informed, opinion and not just coming with preconceived notions.
So if I had to say something, I'd probably use the example of Abel plays the cello.
Yeah.
So I've only recently actually seen what he does on his cello, but I've recently seen a clip shared on social media of him playing the cello. I think it was on CNN or something. So in his approach to playing cello, I was very struck by how it was not traditionally classical. And as we all know, classical instruments are taught by means of classical traditional methods. And I would definitely encourage the learning of a classical instrument within the idioms that are rooted in the community. So if you want to play a Guma rhythm on the cello, then go for it, because that is how you will understand the instrument much better, to understand it from a place that you come from. Just being able to hear what the student has to say about their community, or whoever it is that you're speaking to about the community, hearing what they have to say, listening for a change, instead of imposing your view, and then seeing how you can integrate what you've learned as the teacher with what the student knows, instead of dismissing it as wrong, because it's not wrong. It's really not wrong. we need to get this word wrong out of our heads when we are teaching, rather like replace it with having the discipline to go and learn the instrument rather than being wrong.
I agree 100% with you. And also like the exploration of your instrument. This is the one thing that jazz taught me that classical music doesn't really focus on, is like really understanding your instrument past everything, understanding theory past just it being something that you have to learn. Like knowing that if I break this practice, or if I as a clarinet player push my mouthpiece too deep into my mouth, it's not just because my teacher told me that it's bad. This is the sound that I'm going to get from it, so I can actually access that sound when I want to. And then from a composer's perspective, like what we can really do is we can orchestras can contact Stellenbosch University composition department, and I would gladly have my students interact in that way, because that means that gives them a first-hand interaction with community music. But at the same time, it puts the music in a medium that the orchestra can perform, because we also do have to admit that there are certain things that the instruments can't do. So there is some knowledge that we have to have. What works better, or what will sound better, and if we can engage in that way, so that we're not trying to take over someone's voice, but we try and help them amplify it actually. That's something that we can do as composers, and especially with young composers.
Unfortunately, our time has run up. It feels like we have not even scratched the surface as to things that we could discuss. Thank you guys so much for this conversation. I think it's definitely necessary and long overdue that we speak about these issues, and that we also allow ourselves to be kind of not open but involved within politics, because we as people are political. The music that we play is political, so we can't distance ourselves from politics and social issues anymore. So thank you so much to you guys.
And again, thank you to you. Like, I think especially for composers, we disappear very quickly. It's very easy for us to just go into our hidey holes. So having someone like you just poking us a little bit is very good. It's very good.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you from my side to you, Len and Arthur. Like, it was so nice to reunite in a conversation that we don't often have, actually.
Yeah.
So so thanks for bringing that to light, and I really hope that we can contribute to the transformation of our music society. And thanks for starting it.
Thank you so much to my guests for their conversation, and to you for your support. If you have enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be posting the next videos on my channel as well as on my Facebook page.